Hey everybody, it's Carrie Lusignan from the Northampton Center for Couples Therapy, and I'm just streaming in today to talk with you a little bit about the concept of ambiguous loss. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but it felt like a really important thing to speak to today. The concept of ambiguous loss first was coined by a woman named Pauline Voss, who is a researcher on grief and loss. And she did a lot of research looking at loss that occurs of things that are less concrete, less tangible than when we have a loved one die. And when she created her ideas around ambiguous loss, one of the things that she came up with was the idea that one way ambiguous loss can occur is when there is the psychological presence of something, but there is the physical absence of it. And that this can constitute a kind of loss that is not always recognized or measured, and grief that goes with it. So what got me thinking about it was I was listening to another one of Brene Brown's podcasts this week. She was interviewing a guy who specializes in research on feelings. And she was talking about how a lot of her research is showing how many of us feel shame around grief. And when we have a feeling about a feeling, we actually have a term for that in the Gottman lexicon. And the term is that it's a meta emotion. So if we're feeling grief, and then layered on top of feeling grief, we're prone to feeling shame about feeling grief, judgment of ourselves. That's the meta emotion. And it's kind of tricky because feelings in and of themselves can be hard enough to navigate, right? Fear, loneliness, despair, those emotions are vulnerable. But then what happens is we layer other feelings onto our feelings. And when that happens, when we start judging our emotions, that can get us into more trouble. And what it can do is it can interfere with us actually having the core emotions. So if we're navigating grief right now in different ways, and then we kind of shut it down because we have feelings about that, like we shouldn't feel grief right now. Who are we to grieve? Maybe we haven't even lost anybody directly. That actually wrenches things up, and it makes it more difficult for us to thrive and function in ways that are really going to ensure that our families and our hearts endure and are resilient during this time. So there's actually a Welsh word that I love that speaks to the type of loss that I think is occurring right now, the type of grief that we're navigating. Because in ambiguous loss, if there is the psychological presence of things, but the physical absence, so think about things as simple as you can't go to the store, you can't go for a walk with a friend, you can't go to a meeting with your team members. In your mind, those things are still psychologically present, or you may be doing some modified version of them, but life as it was has changed. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the psychological presence of something, but the physical absence of it. And I'm wondering how you're all doing with it in terms of grief, in terms of really making room for that and not getting into judging it, going into meta emotions. And the word that I want to speak to that some of you may have heard of, Hiraeth, is a Welsh word. And what that word means is it references a deep longing for home and a deep longing that's nostalgic. But what's really cool about this word is that it can pertain to something that was or something that never existed. For example, when people go through a divorce, divorce definitely falls in the category of ambiguous loss. There's still a psychological presence of your ex-partner, but they're physically absent. And it's not recognized as a death in our culture. Nobody's bringing you casseroles. So when you go through a divorce and you're navigating the loss of the relationship, you're not just mourning, from memories. A lot of what you're mourning has to do with dreams that no longer are going to happen, future as you envisioned it no longer occurring. And that's what Hiraeth is talking about. Hiraeth is talking about not just the loss of things that once were. Hiraeth is talking about the loss of things as you imagined they might be. So it's a very specific type of grief, and I think it's very pertinent to our times. This word was being used a lot before COVID-19 came, just in terms of the environment and grief that people are having around the loss that, is happening on our planet. So when we are navigating losses that are incremental and that are elusive, and we can't anticipate what those ultimately will result in, right? We can't anticipate sort of the cumulative effect of that. That creates a lot of uncertainty in us in terms of emotionally where to land. So really what we're talking about is heartache, heartbreak. It's one of my favorite topics. And we're talking about, what is your relationship to heartbreak? Is your tendency to shut it down? Is your tendency to go to optimism? Is your tendency to kind of sink so far in it that you can't kind of put your head above water? And how can we run into heartache? How can we run into it in a way that's going to ensure that we thrive and we find meaning? And while I have other videos on here that talk about it, I think the most important thing I want to say today is that certainly one of the core ways to move into heartache, which grief is often synonymous with, is to first find your grief. Find the ambiguous losses that you're navigating right now. Name them. Look at what you're doing in relationship to them. Notice if you're judging yourself or you're going to shame. Make room in your heart for being a little gentler, for a little bit more compassion. Notice what you're doing in regards to how you respond to other people's grief. I've talked to a number of couples in relationships where one person is totally in the throes of freaking out and crisis over this, and the other person in the relationship is like, yeah, I'm just not really thinking about it. I'm not really dealing with it. What you have there are two people who are navigating pain and emotions and grief really differently. And that can be really tricky. So we want to stay out of judging each other's grief. We want to notice what our own loss is. We want to recognize that ambiguous loss is real loss. And I think in a lot of ways, ambiguous loss is more of a bear to deal with than concrete loss. Because when we are navigating a concrete loss, like a death of a loved one, there's a lot of recognition in the form of rituals and in the form of our culture for that. But when we are navigating something like a miscarriage, or the loss of rituals with our family, or a divorce, or in this case, how COVID-19 has shifted our future, that tends to be much harder to get any kind of consolation around. So it's really important that you're taking good care of your heart right now, that you're making room for those feelings and not shutting them down, and that you're going easy on yourself and others. That's it for today. Thanks a lot for listening, and take good care of your hearts.